Here we go. All right, we're recording. We had technical difficulties, but we have survived. We are back and better than ever. I was introducing Traci LaLiberte, who is the Executive Director at the Center for Advanced Studies of Child Welfare at the University of Minnesota. But first, Joan and I wanted to say what's up. It's good to see you again. We were joking that we dressed up for the occasion. Joan, you got a shout out to Family Alternatives.
Family Alternatives.
There you go. There you go. So Traci is with us this evening, and she is in front of a picture, which is a backdrop of when she was. Were you in Australia for a year?
About 6 months.
About 6 months. And she was telling us a story about this class in particular, and it was about to transition into her position at Cashew. And then I said, stop, say no more. You'll have to tell the students. So without further ado, Traci, welcome to class.
Thank you. This is one of my favorite classes. I love this class, the policy class. And Mary had actually asked me about, how long I'd been in my position or how I got to this position over at the Center for Advanced Studies in Child Welfare. And as most of you guys probably know, we're on the second floor in Peters Hall. And it was in 2007, actually, I was asked to be a guest speaker in this class by the director of Cashew at the time, who was Marcy Jeffries. And as an icebreaker, she started the class. I felt I was a little bit flip, I think, in my answer. And she started the class with an icebreaker and asked me to participate. And basically it was about, where do you see yourself in 5 years? And I finished, about 2 years before with my PhD and stuff. And I was working as a researcher at the U. And I said, well, actually, in the next 5 years, I want to have your job. And I actually had her job in the next 6 months, to be honest with you, because she left in the middle of that semester, and I picked up the class and started teaching it. So for many reasons, policy in particular, but for many reasons, this is one of my favorite classes.
Hey, Traci, is Marcy still over at oh golly, Marion Wright Edelman's place?
I think she's back at Ramsey.
Oh, is she?
I kind of have lost track of her. She was at the State and then she went to Ramsey. And so I don't know where she's at now.
All right.
There you go. Well, Joan, do you want to talk a little bit about the Children's and Family Service Review, and why you asked Traci to come speak last year and then again? And then we'll pick Traci's brain all about that, in addition to the Child Welfare Academy.
All right. Well, the CFSR is on Canvas. The most recent one is on Canvas. So everybody has an opportunity to read that. And it's the Child and Family Services Review that's done by the feds. Federal government comes every 4 years and looks at how Minnesota is doing their job with all the federal dollars that they get. So it's a really important process, because it's evaluating the work that Minnesota is doing in the area of child welfare, child protection. And if you look at the CFSR that's on the Canvas, you can see that it's broken down into many different parts. So it looks at some of the areas that our students are actually writing about, like how many children we enter foster care, how quickly we respond to child abuse complaints, that kind of thing. So the feds give money, and they get to come and look at how we're spending the money and whether or not we're doing a good job. And I don't think there's anybody that understands the CFSR and can talk about it more clearly and articulately than Traci. And that's why we've asked her to come and talk about it.
True story.
Well, I don't think that's true. I think that the people at the state that are running the CFSR probably can do a kind of live and breathe this, but I'm happy to talk about it, because I think that while I know some people are like, I don't know, putting in their time, having to get through this particular part of the class, the reality is it's a really, really important part of child welfare, and it is connected to nearly every aspect of what you will do if you're working in the field. And if you're not working directly in counties or tribes, it's still going to impact you if you're working in private agencies, because it is so impactful in terms of the counties and tribes and what the state does. So it is important to understand it. And I don't think that you need to know the nuances and ins and outs of every little aspect, but you got to know, you need to know the basics. So I'm going to kind of do the basics. And then if these guys have some questions, Joan and Mary can ask me some follow-up questions, but otherwise you can really dig into some of those documents that Joan has posted to do that.
And what's available to them is both the federal overview, so the response by the feds, and then the final approved performance improvement plan by the Department of Human Services. So that's what's up on Canvas.
So I think that what's important about the CFSR is that if you think about child welfare is not a very old field of practice in terms of a system, a funded system and structure that's in place. We know child welfare is, old in terms of social work and home visitors and all those kinds of things. But when it comes to having, a
private, right?
Right. But when it comes to having a formal public system set up, you got to think we're talking in the 70s, and Walter Mondale actually introduced the first federal child welfare legislation. So when you think about that, that's not that long ago, right? And as people set up systems and the states were required to do certain things, then the states pushed back to the feds and said, hey, you can't make us have a foster care system and then not give us any money. We can't afford this, or, we can only do this, but not this. And you've got all these requirements. And that was then the trigger. Those unfunded mandates were the trigger for creating the funding streams that come with public child welfare. So the Title IV funding stream that helps support and offset the cost of foster care, for example, or some of your fellow students or yourself might be getting Title IV funding. That all comes because the states pushed back and said, we can't do this without some money. So if you're going to say, no matter where you live in the country, you deserve these protections as children, and all the states have to do these things, then the feds have to pay at least part of that. So that's our history. And that set into motion the creation of child welfare systems, foster care systems. And that's why you often hear people say, there's so much money and incentive in child welfare, and it's big money. It is, because the system was constructed on that reimbursement process. And so it was built a little backwards in that way. And so as all systems, all states across the country have tried to go through system reform, if they can't change the finance part of the system, it's very hard to actually change the structural base for child welfare and how we do things, which is why we continue to put kids in foster care, and we continue to go down that road of permanency and adoption, as opposed to other aspects of child welfare and permanency planning. So that's kind of a little backdrop.
I want to completely side rail you and ask you around how we should reform the system and
nope.
But I'm not going to side rail you.
It's a different class.
Yes.
Okay. So if that's all true, if you believe me and that's all true, then you have to think, okay, so the feds are pouring money into the states in different ways and trying to help states to be able to do this work. And they did that, and they did that, and they did that in different states, all the regions across the country, 12 regions, federal regions across the country, all operate a little bit different. They're like the counties of Minnesota. They all have their own personalities, and they have their own processes. And as long as they all do these base minimum standard things, how they do it isn't necessarily prescribed. Well, because of that, you had tremendous differences in the services that were delivered, the protections that were ensured, and the processes and the systems that were in place across the country. And the feds were just pouring money into money. it wasn't until the 90s, 20 years after all this got started, it wasn't until the 90s that the feds said, maybe we should have a little accountability. You know, maybe we should kind of go out there and see if the states are actually achieving the things that we want them to achieve, using the money in the ways that we want them to use it, and how do we know that kids and families are getting served and that they're better than they were when we started with it in their lives. So the CFSR is that. The CFSR was designed for that purpose. It was about accountability to federal dollars. And to this day, it's still about accountability to federal dollars. You know, it does have the backdrop that it's really about accountability to best practice, but it's tied to the dollars. So there have been several rounds of the CFSR.
Do you know when it was first implemented?
I can't remember the first year the first round went out. They started to develop it in the early 90s, and then they started to do the measure at the end, later in the 90s and then early 2000s. Minnesota was in one of the earlier rounds of round one, and I believe that they did pretty well, to be honest with you. No state passes all the measures with any regularity across these three measures, and there's a reason for that. So I know that you're all also probably taking your research class, right? We're all second year. Are we second year taking that year-long research class that you love?
They love it. They've talked a lot about loving it.
I know, you love it so much. Well, if you think about what you've learned in research, right, when you want to measure things, and sometimes when you measure things or put things in place, there's unintended consequences, right? And it's as important to measure the unintended consequences of a policy sometimes as what the intended outcome is. And the CFSR really brought that to light, because in the earliest version, CFSR 1 and CFSR 2, some of the measures contradicted each other. If you did well in one measure, you kind of automatically were going to do poorly on another measure. And I think that as they crafted it, it was a problem in terms of how they crafted the measurement. And so prior to CFSR 3, some pretty well-known child welfare researchers in the country had a number of meetings with the feds and said, you got to change this because you are motivating people to do well and they're doing poorly, and kids and families are doing poorly in other ways. It's an unintended consequence, and it's being driven by your research and your measures.
Can you give an example of like a measure that then had an unintended consequence?
Sure. So one of the things we haven't talked about is benchmarks. The CFSR sets benchmarks, and so they might say, timeliness to the first interview. 90% of all visits have to be done within a certain period of time, as an example. It's a benchmark. And then you're measured based on whether or not you meet that. And so say in Minnesota, we only meet the timeliness 70% of the time. But the benchmark is 90, which means you don't pass that measure, okay? So if you have a measure that is about a quick line to permanency,
right, okay, yep.
Right? And so we push really hard to get kids to permanent situations so that we can meet that benchmark. What they found was that their re-entry rate was inflating. Kids were getting pushed home, families weren't ready, services weren't continued, supports weren't continued, and then all of a sudden they'd see a consistency for states that had really met that measure of timeliness to permanency. They also had much higher rates and couldn't pass their re-entry benchmarks.
Okay. That's a perfect example.
Yeah. And so they had 2 or 3 of those that were kind of looping through in CFSR 1 and CFSR 2. From a research standpoint, it's good to continue to improve your instrumentation, right? You want to be able to do a better job of measuring what it is that you say you want to measure. And so the fact that these happen every 4 to 6 years, you've got people who are kind of, tweaking that a little bit. But the problem with that is when you tweak your measures, and depending upon exactly how big that tweak might be, now you can't compare from 1 to 2, or you can't compare from 2 to 3, because the way you're measuring it and what you're actually measuring is different. And so that's been a big criticism of the CFSR. And for an example, in Minnesota did really well in CFSR 1. They did really pretty well in CFSR 2, not perfect, not as good as 1, right? Because the measures got a little bit more sensitive, but they were doing pretty well. CFSR 3, we failed 13 of the 14 measures.
Well,
We were
it was a
out
bomb.
We were out of substantial compliance. Now, did the practice in Minnesota change so terrifically between the CFSR 2 and the CFSR 3? No. Practice did not change that much. It's the measures and what they were looking at and how they were measuring it that changed. And that placed, and Minnesota is not alone. Many states across the country did much worse in their measures on CFSR 3 than they ever had before. And again, it's because the measures changed. It wasn't that the practice had gotten that much different.
Okay. And am I understanding the breakdown of it well enough? I have it pulled up, and it's the outcomes and then the items underneath each outcome.
So you've got outcomes and you've got systems. And in outcomes, Minnesota was out of substantial compliance, which is a real fancy way of saying we failed those measures.
Okay.
7 out of 7.
Okay.
And in the system measures, 6 out of 7.
Okay.
So what that then means.
Yeah, what's the difference between the two?
Yep. What that means is that any measure that you're not in substantial compliance with, you don't hit the benchmark, right? That has to be included. You basically have to have a case plan for the state, is essentially what it is, a treatment plan, a case plan, a change management plan, if you will, where each one of the measures, the outcome measures and the system measures, are listed in terms of, and this is the document that you guys have, that's the
performance
federal
improvement
document. And then the state has to say what actions, what steps are they going to take to be able to get toward compliance. And that's a really important thing to hear. So I'm going to say that again. The state has to write into their PIP, this is the program improvement plan. This is, the message to the feds. Okay, we understand that we're not in compliance. We understand that we're not meeting these benchmarks. Here's what we're going to do so that the next time you come and see us, we've done better. The program improvement plan does not require them to meet the benchmark. The program improvement plan requires them to make improvements. And
How do they measure the what is it?
And the state gets to say what that is.
Oh, okay.
So think about this. So I think about family alternatives. Maybe I come out, maybe there's something that you're not doing right, and I'm the state. I'm going to say, and here's what you have to do. I'm going to tell you what that is. The feds don't do that. That's not the way the CFSR is done. The CFSR is, you haven't passed these things. Now we want you to spend some time thinking about what can you do differently. And it's very hard in a county-based system to do this as compared to a state system, because you've got to say, with all the autonomy that the counties have, these are the things that we can ensure, right? So thinking about how we have to get toward those benchmarks, what are the things that we're going to do that we want you to come back and basically grade us on? It's not hitting the benchmark, it's making change. And the state has to write that for themselves, and then the feds get to say yes or no.
Got it.
And so Minnesota wrote it, and then the feds reviewed it, And maybe the feds came back and said, you know, you're not really asking enough of yourself in this area, or you're not really pushing yourself enough in this area. And they would go back and forth and negotiate that. And the reason that that's important is because there's money tied to this. There's funding that's tied to this. If the feds come back and do a site visit like they did just this last winter, and the state isn't meeting their improvement goals, then they can get financially sanctioned in their federal allocation, their federal dollars. Again, they're not jeopardized for not passing the CFSR, but they are penalized for not meeting their PIP.
Okay, and that is one of the documents we do have up on Canvas, which is the approved PIP.
Yeah. So I feel like this is like heavy and people are like, ugh. Okay, so one more thing that I think it's really important for people to know. I mean, I'm kind of, geeking out on this. I love it. But at the same time, I get it's a little bit hard and a lot in the weeds. Now, I think it's really important for you also to know, since you're all in this research class too, like, how do they do this? Like, how do they pull the measures? Because there's a lot of those measures, especially in the outcome measures that are around well-being, that they can't pull from SSIS. This isn't strictly administrative data. The CFSR is, the final review of the CFSR is an on-site review, which means a team of feds comes to the state and spends a week. And in that week, they review 60 hard copy cases and the electronic counterparts to that. They conduct a number of interviews of people who are service recipients within the child welfare field, private provider partners, academic partners. They do a number of listening sessions to understand how the constituency within the field thinks that people are doing on some of these measures. And then they do case record reviews, really intensive reviews, paper pencil reviews of all of the measures as it's documented, or the absence of the documentation in case records. Now think about that. And this is the same for every single state. Another criticism of the CFSR, every single state's CFSR determination is based on 60 cases.
Yeah.
And interviews.
The number of cases that California has can't possibly be compared to the number of states that Alabama has. And yet it's the exact same process and the same denominator.
Wow.
So the way that the feds do it is when they come in, they know that they're going to pull 60 cases, and they're going to do it across 3 jurisdictions. So it always has to be the largest county in the state. So no matter what happens, our CFSR scores are always going to be largely influenced by what happens in Hennepin County. Always, forever. That's, unless they change the federal ruling on that. How Hennepin is performing, it's largely going to influence how the state CFSR comes out, which is why the state and Hennepin do have to do quite a bit of work in collaboration together, right? I mean, all counties have to do that with the state, but Hennepin has a particular influence in our federal.
In that vein, Tracy, one of the questions I had was, when the state's preparing their program improvement plan, do they involve people from like Hennepin County and other parts of the state for that?
Yep, there's usually a large, that's a great question. There's usually a large work group that is comprised of a pretty interdisciplinary and certainly geographically diverse group that comes together that helps to shape the CFSR, or the PIP rather, the development of the PIP, what it is that we're gonna say, this is what we think is good enough to show progress, and those kinds of things. But ultimately the state has to submit it. But I think that the state has done, Lori Munsterman is in charge of this in the CQI unit at DHS. And she's good at reaching out and being able to get input.
I know that I, as a executive director of a private foster care agency, was part of the interviewing process, but I was never asked for any input on the PIP.
on the PIP.
I'm just wondering if any private agencies were involved, or is it only the publics?
Yeah, no, there would, I would imagine on the website where they have to post the PIP, there was probably minute meetings or a listing of who was involved in doing that. Usually the state has to be pretty transparent about that.
Mhm.
Yeah. So again, we're talking 60 cases, always has to be Hennepin County. So you're going to always have the biggest county. You're going to always have one of the, a county from greater Minnesota or some, you know, something that brings in some geographic
Mhm.
and rural diversity, and then a smaller county. And how they pick those other two counties, it changes, but
Mhm.
they're different. They're always different. It's Hennepin is the constant. And
Mhm.
so I think that's really important for everybody to remember, again, that all these measures are standardized for every state. And you have to think, you know, child welfare in Yellow Medicine, it does look a little bit different than it does in Hennepin County,
Mhm.
right? Or child welfare in Becker looks a little different than it does in Ramsey or Dakota County.
Mhm.
Um, and community standards around, you know, what we see as neglect or what we see as risk.
Mhm.
There's a little bit of a continuum and a give on that.
Mhm.
So think about what happens in Montana versus what happens in New York City. Like kids ride the subway in New York City. You know, other places might say that is, you know,
A safety issue.
unsupervised and
Yeah.
dangerous and
Mhm.
poor judgment, right? Um, and so when you have measures that are really standard across all of those areas and don't take the nuance of context into place, you know, you're just naturally going to have some challenges. But not doing that means then you can't compare, you know, A to B to C. So, you know, so there's some give and take in the CFSR.
Mhm.
Um, Minnesota used to then, the state then would go out regularly and do CFSR, like little internal audits to make sure that the counties were complying and doing what it needed to do, and that they had their own measures or report cards on how they were doing in the CFSR. And that would be done every year in between the big federal visits, that the
Mhm.
state, that's part of the state's evaluation plan, is doing their own monitoring of CFSR outcomes. And they've changed the schedule of that a little bit. It used to be like, I think that everybody used to be every 2 years, you know, and keeping that up. And it didn't make sense, again, because you had some counties that had very few cases and other counties that had greater cases that needed
Mhm.
more support. And so they've altered the way that they have that schedule in terms of how frequently there are those CFSR reviews in counties, and
Okay.
it's a much more tailored plan now. So people can check with their counties of where they're working or doing their internship to kind of ask that question.
So what does it all like? So what does it all mean? Because
Well,
that's a loaded question, and you know, and we talked about it a little bit before. Like, how does this then impact what happens in a legislative session?
right.
How does this drive policy and we know practice change? Just curious for your feedback on that.
Well, I think that the general intent is that what the CFSR should be doing is giving states and counties information about how it is that they're doing in their service delivery to kids and families. And that it really is about having a standard way of looking at that over time, so
Mhm.
that they can make you know, internal recommendations and plans for doing better. I mean,
Mhm.
that's really what it's about. But because it also serves as the accountability measure, it
Right.
attaches to the federal dollars, and that that Minnesota can and has been sanctioned for not meeting some of its measures, and the state doesn't take that hit alone. The
Right.
sanction is against the state, but the state then passes that on
Right. Right.
proportionately back to the
Mhm.
counties.
Mhm.
And so if all of a sudden you lose $500,000 that you were counting on, you know, you do your budget, you know, at the end of last year for next year, and you get halfway through the year and find out you're not going to get $500,000.
Mhm.
Well, what does that mean? That means you're not hiring positions that you desperately need. That means caseloads are going up. That means you may not be able to purchase a service that you know is a good service that you want to be able to offer families. So you've got a reduction in services. I mean,
Which then an unintended consequence of that would be suffering of family. I mean, who loses? Kids and
Well,
families,
kids and
right?
families lose, right? Because if I
Yeah.
can't get the services that I need to show the change that needs to be made so that my kid can stay home,
Right.
then maybe they take my kid. And you know what? Those dollars, because that's a different funding stream out of Title IV, those are entitlement dollars. Those dollars are going to flow no matter what.
Yeah.
Which again gets to the fact that the funding of our system is so backwards and drives unintended consequences regularly. And we have to just be clear about that, right?
Yep.
I mean, that takes federal legislative change for us to make that happen differently. And that
Yep.
is in some regard what the intent of Families First is meant to do,
Yeah.
is to get upstream and have prevention service dollars in play in a different way than they are now, and to kind of de-link it out of the entitlement dollars. But there's challenges with that too.
Yeah, we've talked a little bit, and that could probably be its own class as well, for sure, on Family First.
This is Fresca, by the way, just saying.
Oh.
One of the things that that I think is an unintended consequence is what I think of as the rule-driven or the bureaucratization of child welfare services. So we had a couple of workers from Hennepin County come in and talk with our class, and they actually said that they keep a copy of the state statutes next to their computer, and they look at the state statutes always when they're making decisions and stuff. And it really pulls people away from the face-to-face family contact and just using good social work judgment, I think, for what happens. I'm not saying that that would necessarily be good either, but what's your response to that? I mean, we have such a rule-driven, almost faceless kind of system.
Punitive on
Punitive.
all ends. Yeah.
Well, I think that has been the challenge, continues to be the challenge, and will continue to be the challenge in child welfare unless we really change and reform the system, because our system is built on a carrot and stick system, right? Because as long as we're having substantiations and there's the litigious aspect of child welfare, then it creates more challenges for social workers to deliver the art of social work, if you will, in terms of what is the nuance of what's happening in a family. Just use the structured decision-making tool as an example. So everybody should be pretty familiar with the structured decision-making tool. The reality is that tool is meant to be a tool. It is not meant to be a checklist that gives you the answer. But high caseloads, people being worried about, I'm going to get caught out if I go against, here was this documentation that said it was high risk, and then I let these kids go home, and there was good reason for it, and we had good judgment. There was lots of protective factors, and here's what it was. People get nervous. You also have the influence of the county attorney's office, and depending on what county you're in, what that relationship is between child welfare and the county attorney, you take a much more litigious, restrictive, standard-driven approach than you do the interactive, relational, professional interaction kind of approach. And Minnesota has a continuum, and we ebb and flow, and everybody does. I worked for, more than a decade in Connecticut in child protection and did frontline work. And it's the same there, right? The best workers are the workers that can stop and have conversations, manage, all of those competing interests, and think about this family in front of me, right? Case plans are tailored. They're not cookie cutter. When we go to court, the documents that I've put together are very much about this kid's special education, this kid's relationship with people in the community, this parent's substance abuse challenges, and what are their strengths and protective factors and opportunities. And the more, pressure that gets put on our workforce, students are going to graduate. Everybody watching this, you're going to graduate, you're going to go out with passion, you're going to want to be in there doing the very best work that you have learned at school to do, the assessment, the engagement, all those things. 5 years later, when we check in with people, some people continue to be able to do that, and other people have really succumbed to that pressure of that standardization, or you can't do that, or that's not how we do it here. And your ability to push back, and your ability as students and young professionals to be able to advocate for system change is essential to these things not happening the way that Joan described. So when people sit in this class and think, oh, I don't do policy, what does it matter? You know, I'm a practitioner. Well, but you're a practitioner that has a responsibility to advocate for what is right and what you know to be true as a professional, a social work professional that's in a value-based profession. That's different. It's different than other professions. You have a obligation, and policy is part of that. How that impacts drives the money, drives what you do for practice. It's connected, and you can't disentangle that.
I'm curious, without getting, because we want to get to the Child Welfare Training Academy too, but I'm curious if you can explain Family First's attempt from a federal level, just to break down how to use the funding dollars differently and allocating 4E to prevention.
So the origins of Family First really started back with Hillary Clinton when she was a senator. She first introduced some of this legislation, and really what she was trying to do was to be able to help de-link the Title 4E means testing from the services, and to be able to change the definitions of how that reimbursement would happen. Because we know in Title 4E, it's means tested to AFDC standards of poverty from 1996. So what that means is in Minnesota, and it's restricted to kids who are in foster care or at high risk of going into foster care, right? In Minnesota, as a statewide average this year, 57.15% of the kids who receive services through foster care or at a high risk of foster care meet that standard. They come from families that meet that standard. So you have to be as poor today
as you were in 96.
Would have been, we're talking extreme poverty, and 57% of our families meet that standard.
Yeah.
Next year, it's 59 and a half. It's going up. It's the wrong direction. More families are in poverty for next year's
and we've talked all semester long about the underlying threat of all of this.
So what Senator Clinton was trying to do was to say, let's get rid of the AFDC. Let's get the states more dollars for all the kids that they're serving. And let's not make it specific to kids in foster care or the deep end of the system. Let's get services and dollars to prevent kids from even going into placement. Like families come to our attention, let's help them with what they need help with right away up front. It was never successful to be passed under Title 4E as revisions of delinking it. And so they pulled it out and did a new bill, which is this Families First bill, in trying to ensure prevention dollars and putting in additional services for youth and youth who are transitioning, and to be able to tackle what our colleagues in disability services has already tackled in terms of, or supposed to have tackled in terms of deinstitutionalization and moving large groups of people out of congregate care when they don't need to be there. And so that's the push around, moving away from residential care. And like everything, we've talked about this before tonight, standardization comes with unintended consequences. There are some kids in this world that need that level of residential care, and they're going to. We can't blanketly say it's bad. So, for me, Families First is an attempt to try to broaden and fund the, to try to brought in the funding stream to help support what the practice actually is in child welfare, because the scope of child welfare services has grown over the last
Right.
20 years.
Also, yeah.
Yeah.
So talk to us about the training academy, which is tied to one of the recommendations and the commitment on the program improvement plan. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe Mary and
It's
Joan will be
Tracy's baby.
maybe Mary and Joan will be really kind to you and break this into 2 segments so that you don't have to sit so long. So 2014 was the governor's task force, the Eric Dean case, the increased media scrutiny, and from
Remind
that,
people of Eric Dean, which we talked about.
right. So the governor's task force came out with 93 recommendations for system reform. You've heard that. Probably about 60, just a little bit less than 60. So 2/3 of those recommendations all had some kind of tie or connection back to training, whether it was direct or indirect, directly addressing issues of training for the workforce. So one very explicit recommendation was that the state build a state university partnership, which was in alignment with best practices across the country in terms of other training systems that have been developed. But of course, those were just recommendations. So once those recommendations got put into place, DHS had some work groups that continued to build those out a little bit and put a little bit more meat on the bone, so to speak, make some policy changes internally and do whatever they could to resolve or address a lot of those. Many of those needed legislative intervention or change in order to be enacted. And one of those things was the training system, because there's no dollars for that. They had to allocate legislative dollars.
When was it first proposed to legislation?
So it was first proposed, the state tried to put it forward in the 2017 session, and it didn't move forward. That was the end of Governor Dayton's reign, and he said not funding new initiatives, even though it was his task force. In general, the blanket was
I forgot that.
And then we put it forward again in 18. Now 18 was a policy year, it was not a general funding year, and it's very hard to get things passed with a big dollar price tag attached to them, and this was several $1 million. And but we did it, we moved it forward anyway. It did make it into the governor's bill, and we also then had to try to move it along in a parallel way. So this is where I love policy and I get policy, but boy, oh boy, did I realize how much I didn't really know about policy until I, kind of got into this. Representative Ron Krisha was on the governor's task force and continued to be interested. And so he said that he would write the bill and try to move that forward from his perspective, as long as I was willing to serve as the research expert and talk in committees about, what the research said about training and different models of training across the country, which I did. It got very complicated, because it also appeared to be quite self-serving, because if you're going to create a state university partnership and I am employed by the state's largest university, right? It feels, the lines felt a little bit blurred. And so we spent a lot of time being really transparent about that and talking about that, regardless of which university partnered with the state, this is best practice and this is what we want to be doing. There had to be a companion bill in the Senate, right? Because if you've got one bill moving through the House, you've got to have the other bill moving through the Senate. And we didn't have an author. And at that point in time, again, I was trying to serve as the expert. I'm not a lobbyist. I don't have a lobby number, and I'm not allowed to lobby on behalf of the university. And yet there was nobody that was moving that forward. So with some supervision and some direction, I was able to get a senator to agree to author the bill on the Senate side. And
I'm just saying anybody can make policy change.
yes.
I mean, Traci was well positioned too, but you can see a real life example of how to get involved.
I had no idea what I was doing. I'd go to one person's office and they were like, oh, you should go to this office. And then you go over to that office. And then they're like, well, they're not here, but you could go to this person. And it is a little bit like a mouse maze.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
And you just have to be dogged about it. And we had support from, general support from the counties. We had support from private providers in the association. We had support from the employee union. Actually, the ASME union testified quite a bit in different committees about this. So in the end, because it wasn't a funding year, Representative Krisha came up with a creative way to fund the bill, which was when counties got sanctioned for not performing, which we already talked about earlier, where does that money go? That money went into a fund that had been undesignated and could be reallocated back out to counties who did meet all their benchmarks. And his proposal was, well, don't reallocate the dollars. Those counties weren't counting on it anyway. Put it toward the academy. And he balanced the bill using that. And the counties were like, hell to the no, not happening. Nope. You can't take one unfunded, poorly funded program and then like give it to another one. And no. So it wasn't going to pass because it wasn't a funding year. Even though they came up with a proposal, the counties were like, we're not doing it. So it didn't pass in 2018, but it did have bipartisan support, which was great. So it got reintroduced again in 2019. So it feels like maybe it was just 2 years. It was really three and a half years in the making. We moved through the same process. I was a pro by that time. I feel like I had been up at the Capitol at least 2 days a week.
Wow.
And moving things through.
What was your question, Joan?
Who's your senator now?
The senator that authored the bill was Andrew Matthews. And he's from Greater Minnesota, as is Ron Krisha, and both are Republicans. And both sit on the legislative task force, which kind of self-created after the governor's task force as a way to continue to monitor what was happening. And you know what? Senator Matthews doesn't know child welfare. He didn't know very much about it. And I spent a great deal of time, just kind of educating him and having him understand what are the challenges, what are the complexities for the workforce in order to get this done. And why is it so important that we have, a robust training system with some accountability measures so that we can serve kids and families better, so that we can be held accountable in different ways to serving kids and families better. It moved through the same process, almost the exact same committees the second year. You're going through Health and Human Service Reform, you're going through the finance committees, you're going through, because the university was named in the policy, we had to go through the Committee of Higher Education.
Wow.
So there were a number of committees, and then the House passed it and fully funded it, and the Senate didn't. And it also happened to be in Governor Walz's proposal. And so if you remember last year in May of 2019, there were all those closed door meetings and they couldn't get balanced, and then he locked people in a room and they came out balanced. Yeah. We were able to make it through that. We certainly had cuts. We got about 2/3 of what we had asked for in our budget.
Okay.
And it passed as part of the omnibus bill. And as of July 1st, we were up and running. So once it hit and moved really quickly. The Child Welfare Training Academy, as it stands in the bill, has a 4-year kind of phased development and then ongoing funding moving forward. We're leveraging state dollars, again, as part of the Title IV federal match. And so we're able to then pull in the federal dollars to help round out that budget.
Okay.
I can share with you maybe the PowerPoint that I would use to testify. One of the things that we did that
That
was
would be
pretty
cool.
effective was compare Minnesota to another county, because everybody wants it to be another county-based system. So we compared ourselves to Pennsylvania, which had pretty similar rates of referrals of kids for maltreatment reports, and geographic size, and it's a county system, things like that. They had 100 staff in the training system, and Minnesota has 14 at the time.
Whoa.
Their funding was, our funding was like $11, of training dollars are spent per kid served in Minnesota, and theirs was like 80 or something like that. I can't remember. And so that was really impactful. It was like, we don't need to be the best in the country
Right.
necessarily, or the most well-funded, but we have to be able to do, some essential work. One of the other things that was included in that was that supervisors in Minnesota weren't required to do any particular type of training. You could become a supervisor in a county or a tribe. And there was leadership training that was offered, but no supervision is a specific skill set. And just because you're an amazing worker doesn't necessarily mean you have the skill set to be a supervisor. So that was included. That's a new component of the training system.
Okay.
Improved methodology for training. We are building a simulation center. So students, similar to how our students go through simulation in family and children, new workers will all go through a simulation process as well to be able to demonstrate skill in real time. There will be a credentialing component. All training will be connected back to the statewide competency set, knowledge, skills, and attitudes that Minnesota has instituted. And then we've got some, advanced training for ongoing workers and things like that across
And
the
privates
state.
will have access.
Privates who are doing child welfare work will certainly have access. Yep, absolutely.
We were excited to be included.
I think that, we're looking at increasing equity coaching and training as a big component. And we've already started that in phase 1 by partnering with the University of Minnesota Duluth Center for Regional and Tribal Child Welfare to do some enhanced ICWA training and working with Indigenous families and communities. So more of that will continue to develop, but year 1, most of the money, especially because we had those cuts as we passed through the legislature, was really about developing a facility that then allows us to do the other work, hire people on and have a space for them to come to do the work and to partner with the community. So phase 1 is really about getting that centralized training academy built, renovated.
And you've got a building. Where is it?
I can update you a little bit at the end on that.
Okay.
We've hired a few folks to be able to have the infrastructure to continue to kind of move forward. And we've also, right before COVID hit, we started listening sessions in the community because, throughout this whole process of reform in Minnesota, there's many different schools of thought about what's most important, what's missing, what's critical. And the reality is, much like students feel in the MSW program, like there just aren't enough hours to get all the different aspects of education or the knowledge that you want. You'd never leave school, right? That's the whole point of being a lifelong learner. And it's the same thing for the training academy. By the time we heard through the governor's task force and the work groups, all the things that people wanted to train on, people would have, 83 days of training, and the counties and the tribes cannot afford for workers to be gone for 83 days of training. I'm making that number up, but a lot like that. And so the first thing we have to do is we have to work with counties and tribes to say, what is, knowing that it's going to be more than it is now, what's the bandwidth? What is your capacity to allow folks to be released from work to go and really focus on their training? That we need to do that differently. Yes, it needs to be front end and it needs to be new worker, but then we need to have them come back and have an iterative training process over the course of, 12 months, 18 months. So that has to be determined. And our intention is to determine that in partnership with the counties and the tribes.
Mm-hmm.
Because only then can we say, okay, now that we know we have X number of days of training, let's think about all the things that everybody thinks needs to be trained and everything that research tells us should be trained, and prioritize that. And then we can start to see, well, what fits? Well, what doesn't fit? And can that be ancillary training in some way?
Mm-hmm.
Our intention is to do that. And we had 20 listening sessions scheduled all across the state of Minnesota. And then
I was excited to go.
I know. And then COVID hit. So we did do one online and it worked okay, but it wasn't quite what we were hoping for, which is also a pretty relational
Right.
exchange. And so right now, the training system is really focused on getting all their new worker training completely online to be able to address the next how many ever months that we're going to be in this situation. And just as of today, they are 100% online.
Okay.
So that's good news. And that took a lot of work for them. And then we're going to work our way back to trying to figure out how we're going to do those listening sessions. But that was an important part of year one. Year two, we're building 4 regional learning centers across the state, along with some corresponding advisory groups, so that, you know, what's needed in the northeast part of the state can look very different than the training that they need in the southwest part of the state. And so the point of those regional training centers is both to be able to help them in terms of not having the distance and the expense of always having to come to the Twin Cities, but also being able to have some real tailored training that meets the needs of their specific region. That happens in year two. The build out of, now that we've had the listening sessions, how is it that we're going to start building all this curriculum? And then how are we going to shift it from the system that they're currently in, which is PathLore, move it over? And by the way, we're building a whole new learner management system and a whole new online system. So lots and lots and lots of moving parts, and it's going to take a while, and it's going to take some patience. I get emails every single day. Well, when are you going to train this? And why?
Oh my gosh!
And I'm like, we're 6 months in, because our contract didn't get in place until September.
Okay.
Tracy, I have 2 questions. When you did the budget with the state, with the legislature, how far out did you have to project for the match and what
it was a 4-year. So it was the first 2 years of the first biennium, and they passed it for 2. And then whatever is in that last year, they call that the tails. I didn't know that, but you wanted to make sure that your budget was in the tails, which means it's ongoing reoccurring dollars.
Right.
And so we did make it into the tails. And so this is funding that will move forward. It'll take an act of the legislature to change that, to kill it.
To not have access to it. Okay.
Okay. So that's built into the original bill.
Yep.
Okay. The other question I had is, it sounds like you may not ever feel like you're really fully up and running. It's kind of a work in process, as you go along and change. Certainly the pandemic has had an impact on it. Is that accurate? I mean, you don't have this is it, got it set, and this is how we're going to do it?
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. It's really meant to be a scale up. As we bring on more staff, some folks will be really focused on, training for foster care or for foster parents. Some people are going to be really focused on that new worker training and the new and enhanced methodologies for that. We have a different group that might be working on the supervisor training and all of those things, and the equity training and working in diverse communities. All those things are going to be working in concert, but they're going to have to hit at different times. And because we do really want to be incredibly transparent and very inclusive of a variety of voices, and be very interdisciplinary, that just takes longer to build that kind of a system when you really truly are getting valuable, true input from folks. And so, we're just trying to help people be, recognize that and be patient as that's going. But I think to your comment, Joan, you're right. It's it's going to unfold over time, and it should never be static, because
Right.
as we learn more in practice, as research continues to inform our practice and our policy, we're going to always want to be updating and making sure that what we're doing is the best practice that we can.
Yeah, yeah. That's impressive.
Yeah.
Because I think
Yeah.
lots of new programs like this end up being kind of static and not evolving as they need to.
Well, we're hoping that, I mean, we are a little bit behind in the new building. Mary had referenced, we're in Roseville. We didn't acquire, we're leasing
Mhm.
a small office building. It's 3 floors. We have 2.5 of the 3 floors, and we have done a complete renovation.
Yeah,
So
I've seen some
complete,
pictures.
I'm sorry?
I've seen some pictures.
Yeah, actually, if folks, I'll put in a plug. We've got our social media up and running for the training academy. It's
Oh,
mnchildwelfaretraining.com is the website. And then we have a Facebook page and I think we have an Instagram page.
Instagram.
We should be in the next week or so posting a couple videos. We have somebody on staff that has some video skills, and they've gone in the building at different junctures of the demolition, and now they're renovating, and now we've got walls up and things like that. So you'll be able to kind of see the progression of what that building is like, and there's some floor plans that are part of those videos that you'll be able to see
Cool.
as it goes. We were planning to be in the building by July 1st, and with COVID and just some other things, it looks like we're going to be closer to the end of August. So we're probably about a month behind, maybe a little bit more than that.
It's a pretty
And
common construction story.
I'm sorry?
It's a pretty common construction story.
It is a common construction story, right along with we're over budget, right? So
Yeah.
we've been really, really good stewards of the money. We're being really, I think, fiscally conservative in terms of what we're building. And that said, this is really meant to be a place to support the workforce, a place where people can come and feel relaxed and be able to really let some things go so they can apply themselves to learning. And so we've got some nice facilities for the learners. We've got 4 training rooms that will be part of this facility. We have a nursing room. We have a wellness room where people can do meditation or just have some quiet time or prayers. There's a foot bath in that room for folks who do prayer. There's a
Nice.
working lounge where people can just kind of sit or take a phone call in the middle of training if they just need a break. There's little huddle rooms that people can go to. There's a lot of space, and it's been designed to be very welcoming, very soft, and frankly, nurturing to the well-being of the workforce, knowing that we have incredibly high rates of secondary trauma,
Mhm.
and that
Yeah.
people are really overloaded. And when they come to training, they need to be able to be present at training.
Mhm.
So we've designed the building with that in mind. So I'm excited. It's, we'll have some kind of an open house. So students, I know you've probably got tons and things, on your calendar, but later this summer, with whatever policies are in place around social distancing and things like that, we will have an open house where people can come and tour and kind of get familiar with what that space is going to look like, so that when we kick off the first trainings, probably in early fall, people can be familiar with it.
Yeah.
Perfect. I'll put up I was just perusing the website. And I mean, you'll be continuing to hire too. So those of the students in the field that have years of experience.
Yep, it's
uh,
true. We're gonna, in year 2, we start hiring a number of curriculum development
Mhm.
positions. We're also hiring some training folks. If some of the students that are taking class live in greater Minnesota, we will be hiring people to staff those regional,
Oh, cool.
and have some flexible workspace for the folks to be able to be at those regional learning
Okay.
centers as well.
Are they, would you be considered a university employee through the Child Welfare Training Academy, or is it an independent entity?
It depends on which job you apply for and get.
Okay.
So the way that we have divided responsibility, it truly is a true partnership between DHS and the university, and that
Okay.
too is time consuming and
Sure.
comes with tons of challenges, but an incredible amount of benefits as well. The university is taking responsibility for I always use the analogy of restaurants. Joan, you'll be happy to know. So if you've ever worked in a restaurant, you know there's front of the house and back of the house, like people that you see and people that you don't see. And DHS really is responsible for the front of the house. So they hire and will continue to employ all the trainers, the people that are front facing, that work with the counties and private providers and the tribes, and people who are doing policy stuff. The university is responsible for all the back of the house stuff. So all the curriculum development and writing, all the innovation and technology and all the IT stuff, all the communications, administration, all the research and evaluation and the building of the new credential process that will be in place. All of that sits on the university side.
Okay.
Wow.
Well, the passing of like
that's a big challenge.
It's a huge challenge.
To link those two, yeah.
I was going to ask in terms of when, once it's determined what's going to be required of a worker, for example, what's the decision? Is that then just internal by county? Is it going to be blanket from the state? In terms of like, if I'm hired at Hennepin County, it's expected of me to do X through the Child Welfare Training Academy. How are those decisions going to be made?
So, well, again, part of that is co-constructed in some of these listening sessions.
So that's
and
still to be determined.
But there is policy, there is statute. Minnesota statute requires that new worker training is completed in the first 6 months of employment. So if we wanted to say new worker training spans 12 months, that would take legislative change. If we want to keep it at 6 months, but then have, and they are required to get X number of hours of additional training in the next 12 months of employment, then we can do some of that through rulemaking. That's an aspect of policy development that I didn't know, but rulemaking, basically when you pass a law or a bill, if rules or requirements have to be put in place as a part of that, the legislature likes to have a little oversight of that so that they're not just giving a blank check to DHS to say, well, and you can make whatever rules you want, because it's kind of like legislation. It's like soft legislation. And so we have an aspect to our bill that gives us a date that rulemaking must be put in place and reviewed by a certain date. And anything beyond that has to get approved by the legislature.
Got it. That's helpful.
Yep.
Wow. I'm tired thinking of all of the work you have ahead of you, and excited to help support the process. And we're really looking forward to having access to it. Historically, a lot of times privates haven't. So.
Well, and I guess my plug for the students is, regardless of what you're going to do, I know some of you are 4E students, some of you are not, regardless of what you're going to do in terms of working with kids and families, it's good to stay informed. It's good to know about these policy things. So, sign up. You can sign up on the Child Welfare Training Academy.
Yeah,
to get
I'll put the link up.
And when something new happens, we'll shoot it out to you. We're not like drowning people in email or anything like that, but it's a good way to keep up, or go to the Facebook page and like it, and then you'll get those kind of announcements. But I also think it's really important to kind of sit back and reflect as a practitioner. How does policy impact me, or how do I touch policy, and in which ways? It's an important, I know that sometimes it's hard and it feels abstract, but it's so, so, so important to think about it, because research and policy and practice are intertwined in ways that cannot be disentangled. And if you only pay attention to one of those things, those other things are going to be moving forward without you, without your voice and your influence. And that isn't good practice. Good practice is that you're paying attention to all of them. You don't have to do all of them, but you have to know all of them.
Yeah, you do. You do. It's really important.
Yeah.
Tracy, this morning I read that today I was supposed to dwell in the margins of hope and possibilities.
Oh, that's nice.
And I feel like I have tonight, listening to you talking about the Academy, the hope and possibilities of really making a difference in child welfare. It's really exciting. And I thank you for all of your work
Yeah,
and your energy that's gone toward that. It's wonderful.
you're welcome.
Absolutely.
It's been really fun to talk to you guys. You got me out of doing 5th grade math tonight, which let me
Woo!
tell you, I have a PhD and I can do statistics and I cannot do 5th grade math. So,
What is that, long division?
oh my God, it's like area, surface, and volume of
Oh,
prisms and all kinds of things like this. And, you know,
Hard
just,
pass.
I don't know. Anyway, life is a little bit challenging for kids these days, having to be, you know,
Oh, yeah.
I hope that the students don't mind my teaching them some things as much as my kids seem to
Tell you
mind
that
it this week.
it's challenging for students too. We're listening to a lot of challenges for students too. It's a
Yeah.
tough time.
It's hard to
Well-
balance everything. And I think that more than anything, we have to give each other grace. I mean, that's something we talk about as we develop the training academy quite a bit is, you know what, we had planned to have this done by June, or we planned to have that other thing done by August. And the reality is we need to have grace with each other. We need to have the community have grace with us. And at the same time, really balance the fact that our child protection professionals are first responders, and they don't have the opportunity for some of that grace in the same way that some of us do. And so this is tangential. We got to end because people are probably dying for a bathroom break. But Mary and I were on a call with a staffer from Senator Klobuchar's office last week, and I did some follow-up again this week. And they are trying to kind of move forward some federal designation to include child protection staff with a formal designation of first responders, because when you have that formal designation, you know, employee assistance is made available to you, and secondary traumatic stress in different ways. The protective equipment is made available to you in different ways, and it likely isn't going to make an immediate difference for us, but looking forward in terms of things down the road, I think it's really important for us. So if you read about that or you hear about ways to advocate, I think it's a really important thing.
Yeah, and I just read that child protection calls in the state of Minnesota are up 26%.
Are up?
Up.
Well, if you think about it, I mean, really think about summer tends to be a slow time because kids aren't being viewed as much by mandated reporters. And so calls tend to go down. But I think, you know, and then we get big surges in the fall after kids have been there, and then they kind of start to discuss things, or things start to happen. I think you've got the perfect storm right now where you've got lots of people at home and
high stress.
The stress is high, the economic stress is high, the community stress is high, the personal space, like we're all social distance, and yet we're all like the walls are coming in on us all at the same time. People have the pressure to do their work, and they're trying to help school their kids. I mean, there's so much pressure that the child welfare folks are busy, and despite and because the domestic violence calls are up and the police are out there more, the police are now serving as the mandated reporters that are calling in more frequently, similar to how teachers would if the kids were still in school. So I think that there's a lot that we don't know that's happening. We're going to continue to just have to take this as it comes. But my sense is things are going to be intense in the field of child welfare for months and months to come because of
I think so too.
the unintended consequences of this stay-at-home order.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Well said. Well, we'll wrap up with the students, and Joan and I continue to receive you with grace, and you should still do your homework, right, Joan?
Yep. And thanks for sharing Australia with us.
Yeah, thanks.
You know what? This was the view outside of my house. I lived in an Airbnb for 6 months on the North Beaches of Australia.
Research, right?
I was doing research and doing a sabbatical with some folks at the University of Sydney on working with parents with disabilities in child protection.
There you go. Well, thank you. Round of applause for Traci.
Woo! See ya. ya.
Thanks so much.
Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Tracy.
You're welcome. Am I hanging up now?